Good afternoon or morning, evening, everyone. My name is Alida Steigler, and I would like to warmly welcome all of you to this Law Transform seminar. Law Transform, the Center on Law and Social Transformation, is a collaboration between the Christian Michelsen Institute and the University of Bergen, and it aims to research how law and rights can enable social change and to what effect. And to do that, we use research and dialogue. And I would like to encourage all of you to follow us on Facebook and to check out our webpage for our upcoming events and regarding our research. Our next event will be on the 28th of October, and it will be on mothers' mobilization against violence in Latin America. And as for today's seminar, we will be talking about what has been happening in the refugee camp Moria on the Greek island of Lesvos in the recent few years, and especially since the 8th of September 2020. The camp, which was originally built to accommodate roughly 3,000 people, and up until recently served as a temporary home for 12,000 people, got completely destroyed by the fires that broke out on the 8th of September. And although illegal migration is not a structural phenomena that is new to these years, it was already happening from the late 1980s. What we see Lesbos now is that Lesbos has become in the last years one of the main epicenters of a violent phase of mobility control and militarization. And along these lines, especially the deal struck between the EU and Turkey in March 2016 made an island a virtual prison for the thousands of migrants that got trapped there. So basically, along these lines, Moria became the biggest refugee camp in Europe, and at the same time also a symbol of a renewed border externalization effort by the European border regime. And before we start with our discussion, I would just like to mention to our audience that everything here is recorded. So everything that is said or asked will be recorded and stay on YouTube. And I would also like to mention to the Zoom audience that throughout the whole event, you are able to ask questions via the chat function. So I would encourage you to use that and ask your questions. And yeah, of course, the physical audience will be able to ask questions as well after the main discussion. And now I would like to introduce our panel. Here physically with us, we have Synnøve Bendiksen, who is a professor at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Bergen, and associate professor, excuse me. And she has been in Lesvos, Moria personally, and she has also followed the refugees on their migration routes in Eastern Europe. And now, to look at our Zoom panelists, we have Lorraine Lita. Are you able to see her? No. Okay, now first I will introduce Edgar. Edgar Cordova is from the University of Mexico, and he is a PhD student in social anthropology, and his interests lie alongside the issues of migration, border control, and legal anthropology, racism. And now I can see that Lorraine is also with us. So Lorraine Lita is a lawyer and at the same time the coordinator of the Legal Central Lesvos, an independent association of legally trained international volunteers who provide free legal aid to asylum seekers and migrants in Lesvos. So welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us today. And I think as a kind of prelude to our upcoming discussions, maybe all of you could tell us a bit about how you are connected to Lesvos. I thought we could start with you, Lorraine, and maybe you can tell us a bit about your organization, the Legal Center Lesvos, and the work you do and the kind of help you provide there.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation for organizing this. So the Legal Center Lesvos opened in Lesvos in 2016. So I've been here since the beginning, along with a group of coordinators who continue to be part of the project, lawyer from Greece, and as well as 3 people who are still supporting the organization from outside Greece. The center was founded in response to the EU-Turkey deal, and the response to the containment of migrants on the Greek islands after March of 2016. With kind of a dual purpose. One, to provide legal aid where it was drastically needed for all the people who are arriving here from Turkey. And second, to document and advocate against both border policies that are exclusionary, that don't recognize migrant rights or the human rights of individuals who are arriving here from Turkey, but also to litigate on their behalf at a European level and work against these policies that ignore and violate migrant rights here. So we started as a group of volunteers, mostly lawyers coming from around the world. And now over the last 4 years, we've grown into a nonprofit organization in Greece, which is staffed by interpreters from the migrant community. We now have 3 Greek attorneys that are part of our team as well. We continue to have volunteers from around the world come and support, and which enables us to provide legal aid and have a bigger capacity to reach more people who need legal assistance and consultation. But we have grown into an organization with more capacity to represent people throughout the procedure and be able to litigate some of the violations that we've been documenting here.
Thank you, Lauren. Now, Edgar, you were in Lesvos yourself in 2016 as a volunteer. Could you tell us a bit about that experience and how it came to happen? You are muted.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I am glad to be here with all of you and those who are watching and listening to us. Yeah, as a part of my master research fieldwork that I did at CSS, I arrived in Lesbos 4 years ago with the intention of analyzing the so-called humanitarian crisis of refugees there, as this Greek island has become one of the primary gateways of migratory transits, but also a node of containment of mobility on the borders of Europe. So I set out to critically analyze the violent effects of the policies and practices of the Greek asylum system on the bodies and subjectivities of migrants from Lesbos after the 2016 Europe-Turkey migration agreement, as well as the complex role of the humanitarian regimes made up of multiple different organizations. So during 3 months, between September and December 2016, I was able to carry out my ethnographic work at Karatepe refugee camp while participating in different activities as a volunteer for the humanitarian organization Movement on the Ground, which gave me the support to access this space where 1,000 people live, most of them families and vulnerable people. However, I also consider it necessary to go beyond these official humanitarian spaces to to better understand the situation of migrants and refugees in Lesbos. Thus, I not only try to account for the social suffering of people and how organizations assist them, but also for the possibilities of resistance and solidarity in the face of criminalization, racism, and the multiple violence exercised by the Greek states and Europe. For instance, I became interested a lot in the multiple demonstrations against European policies, where I met dozens of people surviving in Moria, whose nationalities and races were not eligible for the asylum system, nor deserving of the humanitarian assistance. So this situation led me to document other spaces where these people try to survive, such as the ports, warehouses, and especially Moria. These infamous European detention centers where 4,000 people live in that year, already in very bad and precarious conditions. So in this way, the testimonies of the people, as well as visits to the center to carry out some interviews with Black asylum seekers from different countries in Western Africa, allow me to have a clearer idea of how policies are materialized on the bodies of migrants and refugees. So this is how I was able to more about Moria during my fieldwork in Lesbos.
Thank you, Edgar. And I think it's also very interesting because now Synnøve's personal experience with Lesbos is coming up as well. She actually was there in 2018 as part of her research, and she worked with volunteers. Yeah. But maybe it's best if you tell us about that, Synnøve.
Yeah, sure. So before 2018, I've been working on questions about refugees and migration for a long time. And I've been studying irregular migrants, or people living without papers in Norway. But when 2015 and 16 came along with a lot of migrants, refugees coming in Europe, a lot of hostility, a lot of nation states uproaring against this situation, we also saw simultaneously a welcoming culture. There was a lot of volunteers after 2015 and that position that a lot of European citizens took, actively engaged with refugees who had arrived. And particularly you saw that at Lesvos. So there were volunteers from all over the world, from New Zealand, Australia, US, Italy, Norway, Sweden. And that's why I wanted to go to Lesvos, to understand more about that urgency of helping, the need to help Lesvos. So I did fieldwork with volunteers at Lesvos in 2018. I was also part of a volunteer organization doing the same volunteer work as the volunteers did themselves, but I was always very open that I was there as an anthropologist. I was wanting to understand their motivation, what drove them to Lesvos, and what did they think that they could do? How did they perceive their voluntary practices? And then I also returned 1 year later at a follow-up study to see the situation there, but also as a part of a smaller research project on the Mediterranean death, which we also is another story of that area there.
Thank you all for these introductions. Now I think we can start with the hotspot approach, maybe, which the Moria camp is basically centered around and was born in. Edgar, could you tell us a bit about the European Commission's hotspot approach, what it means, and based on your 3 months there and your research and the connections afterwards, what are the practices, policies you saw in Lesvos and how it affected the refugees there?
Sure. Yeah, the hotspot approach, or what is called like this, was introduced by the Commission European Agenda on Migration in May 2015 as a part of the response to the refugee crisis. It's an hybrid Europe member states tool allowing the deployment of European agencies such as Frontex, the European Asylum Support Office, Europol, to support member states at the Europeans' external borders facing significant migratory pressure. So hotspots were initially designed as an emergency response that intended to assist member states with registration, identification, and first assistance of new arrivals, and thereby enabled to transfer of asylum seekers to other member states under this emergency. However, in the reality, the hotspots as implemented today have become a more permanent filtering mechanism for irregular arrivals and a containment approach limiting access to mainland Europe. So after the Europe-Turkey statement of 2016, the Greek authorities in Lesvos implemented a containment policy which restricts asylum seekers to the island until the determination of their asylum application. So therefore, detention is applied as a standard practice in Lesvos, particularly in Moria, where Moria exists. And all the new arrivals, including children, are de facto detained at Moria, were detained for 20 days officially. So in addition, a pilot project places individuals of low asylum recognition nationalities in closed detention, while they undergo an accelerated asylum procedure without effective access to legal assistance. So the role of competencies of European agencies, particularly the European Asylum Support Office, raised a lot of concerns in terms of accountability, liability, and compliance with the national legislative framework on human rights laws. Albeit responsibility rests with the Greek authorities, the European Asylum Support Office has de facto decision-making powers in the Greek hotspots, as it conducts admissibility interviews and vulnerability assessments, which are followed by the Greek Asylum Service. In this way, there were many concerns about the inadequate reception conditions. So there was a massive overcrowding resulting from the containment policy, the lack of alternative also accommodation on the island, and the continual arrivals in continuation with the reduction in the capacity of operating NGOs has led to substandard conditions for the asylum seekers residing in these hotspots. In Greece, we can confirm that these hotspots like Moria serve as detention centers where people stay for prolonged periods of time, and also these places are paved the way for more restrictive asylum policies towards an externalization of responsibility for international protection to third states outside the European territory. So we can say that this Europe-Turkey deal was like a first model for further European cooperation agreements with North Africa countries or Afghanistan, and the recently introduced concept of regional disembarkation platforms. So from my research, I suggested that Moria is part of a global grammar of securitization and racism toward migrants and refugees in border contexts. So Moria was literally a prison structure made of concrete with wires, bars, and surveillance camera towers. When I used to go there, There always were police bands and dozens of Greek soldiers guarding the multiple points of access to the camp. So following the work of researchers of Liliana Suarez in Spain, I decided to conceive Moria as a black hole, like a militarized and prison-like refugee camp. And Moria can be understood as certain border spaces where displaced population, most of the global south, are dehumanized and racialized, and where regulatory practices such as surveillance, detention, and isolation converge under opaque, changing, and illegible legal frameworks whose purpose is the restriction of all types of rights exercised by the states, international and intergovernmental institutions. So in this framework of violence, I suggested that the ultimate purpose of managing this black hole is political and social subordination, such that the people will voluntarily renounce the right to asylum in Europe as a result of uncertain waiting, the bureaucratization of all our areas of life, and in some cases deaths, as it happened in the last years. So the people living in these spaces cannot access to legal rights such as asylum or adequate humanitarian aid because their humanity itself is questioned, not only because of their nationalities, but also because of their race. So lastly, as a space prohibited to civilians, journalists, activists, researchers, and a large number of human rights observers, this black hole is overlaid with a certain invisibility, and its internal reality is ignored by important sectors of the population in Lesvos, in Greece, and in Europe. So in that time when I have been in Lesvos, I have seen how many local inhabitants see Moria as a mysterious space drowned in a cloud of rumors and quite alien to their lives, despite being a few kilometers from Mytilene, the capital of Lesbos. So those are some observations that I can share with you about Moria. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was very interesting. And based on what you are saying and how it seems to be, what can we say about the rule of these camps? What are the rules that they started? What are the roles that they were created in mind with? But in the end, what is their role now regarding the European border regime? Is it to demotivate people to try to get to mainland Europe, or what would you say, Lorraine? What is the role of these camps, or what do these camps play as a role in the European border regime? And also regarding the hotspot approach, how does it look like? How does it work on the ground regarding the asylum system, the practices, policies, and the reception conditions that you experience in Lesvos?
Yes, thank you. And so just to start with the legal framework under which people started to be contained on the island. So of course, this was part of the European Commission's plan since the year before in 2015 to create these hotspots. There's the EU-Turkey statement, which wasn't an international treaty, but something signed between Turkey and the European Union in 2016. But this was actually then codified into Greek law. So in March of 2016, Greek implemented a completely new asylum procedure wherein they created a border procedure specifically for individuals who arrived to the Greek islands from Turkey. It created the system where people were prohibited from leaving the islands until they completed their asylum procedure, basically creating these hotspots that Edgar described, the different camps on the different islands. Moria, of course, being the most notorious, as it was the site of the most number of arrivals was Lesvos, but conditions, just to mention, were worse or the same in the other Aegean islands, which are receiving a lot of people from Turkey. So Lesvos kind of gets a lot of the attention, and this I want to talk to again later about the kind of the black hole in which these policies exist, because I think Lesvos is kind of the exception that now we do have a lot of documentation. We do have a lot of information about what's happening here because there was this show of solidarity by local population, but then all of the volunteers and different organizations that came in to Lesvos over the last years. And there's areas of Greece where this is not the case, and where you do see an even greater and more systemic violation of people's rights over the years. But going back to this containment policy, so in answer to your question, legally, it was created through this rewriting of the Greek asylum procedure in 2016. But then with the implementation, of course, Greece had to implement all of the EU regulations on reception conditions, on Dublin regulations. But what we've seen in practice is that well, some measures of these regulations are met in terms of detention, in terms of identification procedures, the role of EASO and Frontex. The rights of migrants, which are also guaranteed in European regulations, are being systemically denied. And so it's become clear that this is a policy of deterrence, not only from Greece, but from the European Commission, from the European member states that are supporting Greece at every step of the way. So throughout its history as a reception identification center, Hotspot, Moria camp has, people are denied access to adequate housing, people are denied access to healthcare, they're denied access to education, to basic human rights that every person is guaranteed regardless of their asylum status. And then I could go into more details about all the problems within the asylum procedure itself that we've documented throughout the years. Edgar mentioned, for example, the role of the European Asylum Support Office, which technically has a mandate to provide technical assistance to member states who receive an influx of migrants, asylum seekers from third countries. We have seen that they've had a very extensive role on the islands, and this has continuously been extended, in which they have an integral role in the decision-making process in individuals' asylum claims. They are the ones who are conducting interviews, who are making recommendations to the Greek Asylum Service about people's claims, who are undergoing assessments on the best interest of children, unaccompanied minors who arrive to Lesvos. And they have been very problematic ways in which they have done this. They came with a clear agenda of implementing the EU-Turkey deal. They were consistently writing opinions on individuals' cases, saying that Turkey was a safe third country, that people should be sent back to Turkey to have their asylum claims heard there. So they came along with a European agenda from what we've been able to document from the cases that we followed. And so within this system, people's rights have continuously been violated, and we've seen an evolution of this over the years, which has led to the situation we're in today, where, I mean, this is not the first fire that's happened in Moria. There's been fires that have happened continuously, and when you keep people contained in these types of conditions, it's natural that tensions will increase between communities, tensions will increase with the local population. And this is something, I don't know how much you wanted me to get into right now. I mean, everything that's happened over the last year in Lesvos, which has kind of seen an explosion as a result of these 4 years of containment policy. I guess just to summarize, and we can go into more detail later if you're interested, but with the change in government in Greece of last summer, a new government was voted into power. They are more conservative. They had a platform that they were voted in on of enforcing the borders, of creating more detention centers, of preventing migration from Turkey to Greece. And so since they have come into power, they have had a clear political agenda of creating detention centers, of detaining people on the islands, and of trying to enforce more returns to Turkey. Through the events of 2020, which have affected the whole world in terms of the COVID crisis now, for example, there are no deportations being carried out. But what we have seen is that the Greek government, with the full support of the European Commission and with the full support of European member states, has instead developed policies of detention and of preventing people from even reaching the Greek islands. So what we saw since March of 2020, this was after several months of unrest and violent attacks against migrants, violent attacks against solidarity workers here in Lesvos by far-right elements of the population, which came after years of a failure of the Greek government, of the European Commission, of European member states to really acknowledge that containing this many people on an island in these conditions was going to impact the local population. So after all of these violent attacks and moves by the government to create detention centers, which were resisted by the local population, who were opposed to any new centers for migrants, for asylum seekers on the islands. So the central government in Greece was trying to implement these detention centers basically since they came into power last year. The local population was resisting. And now, since the COVID lockdown, what we've seen is they've used the COVID lockdown as an excuse to detain asylum seekers, along with carrying out many other violations that we've been documented over the last 6 months. So, sorry, I'm going a little bit all over the place, but in terms of enforcement of the borders, because they haven't been able to carry out detentions because there's no travel between Greece and Turkey. What we've seen is an increase in the Greek authorities being involved in collectively expelling migrants who are arriving in Greece. So who are arriving in Greek waters or who have arrived even on the Greek islands and are then being returned to the Aegean Sea, where they're later rescued by the Turkish Coast Guard. This is not to say the Turkish Coast Guard is some sort of benevolent body. They, of course, are the first force that is preventing people from leaving Turkey, paid by, again, European member states to do just that. But for those who do manage to reach Greek waters, they have the right to seek asylum. They have a right to have their claims individually assessed, and this is being denied to them. They're being returned to the middle of the sea in inflatable mortarless boats, where the Greek authorities are putting their lives at danger, but also denying them the right to seek asylum in Europe. So this is happening on one side, that people are prevented from actually reaching Greece at this point, for the most part. But then also, there's been this move to contain people. So at a time in Greece when restrictions were being lifted because COVID had been under control at that time, people who lived in refugee camps were still restricted. So there was a discriminatory lifting of movement restrictions that was happening, which basically allowed the Greek government to continue detaining migrants. And then slowly moving towards policy of detainment. And what we saw in Moria was actually just a few days after the first case of COVID was detected in Moria camp. On that same day, the Greek government signed a contract with a construction company to turn Moria into a detention center. And a few days later, we saw the fire break out in Moria. And I think the Greek government, the European Commission, for so long had dehumanized this population that they forgot that maybe some people might react if there's an order to turn a place into a detention center. I mean, we don't know who set the fire, but I think it's not, I mean, even the local population, which had been opposed to detention centers, to creating more permanent structures on the island, they also might react to this kind of news that they're going to be building an official detention center where Moria camp had been kind of an unofficial space for so many years. So I think it was no surprise to any of us who've been living here, who've been working here over the last years that this happened. And I think this is the result that will always happen when you contain people in these kinds of conditions without any kind of sustainable approach.
Yes, so on many hands, we can see that maybe it was something that we should have been able to foresee, or that maybe people already foreseen before these times. So Nova, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I totally agree with the idea that this was not really a surprise to anyone. And in some ways, we can look at the Inferno at Lesvos to be a critical event, which is casting light on several crises which were ongoing at the same time. One of those crises were the economic crisis, which has been going on, which started a decade ago, and which hit Greece particularly hard. And although they were going out of that economic crisis, they're still in it. Another crisis which is ongoing at the same time is, of course, the COVID crisis. And Lorraine talked about how the COVID-19 had a big impact on how the government was treating the migrants, because the COVID-19 hits differently and very, and it also legitimizes an otherwise unacceptable policy, such as closing in a population without sufficient food and without sufficient health care. Then we see a humanitarian crisis unfolding here. People who have lived far too long under poor conditions, poor sanitary conditions and security, and a lack of hope that that situation will actually change. And I'd like to linger a little bit with that humanitarian crisis. Edgar talked about the black hole, which is one way of looking at it. And in a similar analytical approach to that is to think with the Italian philosopher Agamben. So Agamben has talked about the term camp and how this camp is a form of power technology that works by separating people. So the camp, like Camp for Refugees, distinguishes between those people who are being given the possibility to flourish and those people who can be sacrificed. So this camp separates the unwanted and the undesired from the rest of the population. So these camps are very often considered as exceptional camps, exceptional spaces, where certain subjects, so then people as subjects, are confined, they're held back, and they are temporarily stuck or contained. And these camps are also places where people are reclassified, they are numbered, and they are also included in a regime with strict regulations for mobility and with regulations for social interaction. So this regime then is legitimized and accepted by referring to its temporality, that it's not permanent, that it is actually the camp, the regime is very exceptional, is an exceptional in an exceptional time, and that's how it is legitimized. But on Lesvos, as we have heard Lorraine talk about, and also Edgar, we see that life in the camp went from being temporary, time limited, to become more and more permanent. The control of the arrivals took place in camps and then went from being a transit. The idea was that these should be transit camps, but these becomes more a waiting zone. When you get into the camps, you don't know when you're going to get out of the camp again. So the uncertainty about how long this time will go on, how long will your time in the camp continue for, this is felt very existential. It becomes a very existential situation for people. And the camp also becomes a place where political repression, new principle of exclusion and confinement, new forms of categorizing people, separating, and new forms of custody are being taken into practice. And then let me add, and this is something that Lorraine also alluded to it towards the end of her talk, is that in these camps, we can also find where people are suppressed. They can also, in some circumstances, become places where new forms of action, new forms of solidarity, care, and new political agency, new political identity can take form. So kind of despite all the violence and the repression being done towards them, or perhaps exactly because of that repression, these spaces can also become a place where you can find that places where you can trigger political activity, so political action. And I think one of the things, one way of how we can understand the fire at Moria is also a reaction, is a response, it's a political response towards that way of degrading them as human beings. And actually also it is a political action towards being forgotten and being treated the way they were. But I'd like to just take, to continue with the crisis, because I think it's also, this critical event is also alluring us to two other crises. And one of them is, of course, the European crisis. And we have heard Edgar and Lorraine both talk about how Moria camp is kind of a symbol of how the European policy is not working, the lack of solidarity within EU, the increased right-wing radicalism, and the hotspot and the Dublin failure, how it's not working. At the same time, the overcrowded camp and its miserable conditions are also a symbol, or also informs us about the global crisis. It reminds us of the civil war in Syria, other places which are facing violence and war. And it shows very clearly a global system crisis, because the camp at Moria is just one camp of very many other camps globally. It's part of a long story about people living and growing up in camps. It's just that fortunately, we're not used to seeing that in Europe these days.
Yes, I agree, and I think it would be really interesting if we went back to Lorraine now and about this black hole concept, and how, in truth, as you said, Lesvos is actually not that dark of a hole. Maybe could you elaborate a bit more on that, because I think that could be really interesting, and this connecting to where we are now.
Yes, so I mean, just a few examples of things that are happening in other places on the Greek border, which now we've seen an evolution of it, and these things are now being part of government policy or practiced in the open. But for example, if you compare the Aegean Islands with the Evros border, the Evros border region has for many years been a kind of black hole in terms of human rights of those who are arriving in Greece from Turkey. There's been some groups who've managed to document pushbacks that are happening there, but systematically over the past years without any kind of accountability by the Greek authorities. And where people who may have been living in Greece even for years are sometimes picked up by the police or by ununiformed militiamen and sent back to Turkey. This has been happening for years, and there has been no kind of response. And I think part of it is due to a lack of people who are working in the region who are able to kind of force the government to respond to this happening. And then just an example closer to here. So since January of 2020, all asylum seekers, all migrants who arrived to Kos Island from Turkey, which is one of the 5 hotspots, they've been held in detention upon arrival. They've been held in detention throughout the asylum procedure. This is something the government now has plans to expand throughout the Aegean Islands, throughout the hotspots. That's why they're moving towards building these new detention centers. But this is something I think that they were more easily able to do because there weren't as many people trying to work and document it. Unfortunately, what we've seen in the last months is that these policies which at one point were happening in kind of a black hole, they're now being practiced openly. They're being extended throughout the Greek border with the collective expulsions at sea that I was talking about earlier. And then even with the European Migration Pact, which kind of endorsed the enforcement of European borders, the detention of migrants, a focus on return of people who are ineligible for refugee status for international protection. So it's as if these governments no longer even have to operate in black holes anymore. The policies that were once happening in the dark, they're happening in the open with the full support of European member states. So I think there was something else I wanted to mention. about that. But I think yes, this move globally, I think, towards these kinds of policies is something that it's the fact that it's happening in the open is one thing, but it's based on policies that have existed for years. So, for example, asylum, the regime of international protection itself is an exclusionary regime, and I think it's important. Edgar mentioned this at the beginning when he was speaking about those who are not deemed worthy of staying in Europe, who are treated as migrants not eligible to be here. This is the basis of European migration policy, to distinguish between those who are eligible for international protection, which is only applied to certain nationalities. I mean, this is something we all know, but I think it's important remarking on. You can migrate if you come from certain North American countries. Countries within Europe, you have more easily, you can migrate between countries. From the global south, it's restricted to those who are able to show that they will face persecution in their home country, that their life is at risk in their home country. This is an unreasonable standard, which in effect is excluding people who have many different reasons for migrating. And don't need to go into all the different causes of global migration, but just remembering that this asylum system itself is built on policies of exclusion, and exclusion of certain races, exclusion of certain nationalities.
Yeah, and I think it's also where the work of voluntary organization and NGOs come in, because they could be the ones who try to fight against these underlying political problems. And Synnøve, you also work on voluntary organizations and theories around it. So could you tell us?
Yeah, well, I think in the research on humanitarianism, there's always this doubleness of humanitarianism as a concept, as an idea, and how that creates ideas of which lives can be saved and which lives are worth saving, even if that's not the intention of humanitarian organization. And there's also a discussion within that research about how humanitarian organizations risk to actually partake in the power which are there to suppress refugees. Again, unintended. It's not the desire of the organizations to do so, but by being there and by offering limited help, they also legitimize the situation, and they also make a situation to continue, which should not be continuing. So there's a lot of difficulties in understanding. It's not one way of understanding the role of humanitarian organizations. But what I want to stress here is that what we've seen in the COVID-19 situation is that it has changed, and it is actually also transforming the humanitarian space, because the states are not willing or able to actually provide an adequate response to their emergency. I mean, the states are now really focusing on the national emergency responses. And the effect of the pandemic on refugees is forgotten, right? So refugees are left in camps where they cannot practice social distance. They don't have access to sufficient healthcare, etc. At the same time, the COVID-19 has diverted the interest and focus of the nation states. So the role of the NGOs now that we see that they're doing is actually that they are trying to remember states that they have a moral responsibility. They have a moral responsibility to take care of refugees. And they also play the role of reminding the state that internal security is not the only problem, and that those living outside the states are not a threat, and that they need to be protected and assisted and welcomed. And at the same time, what we see also is that the pandemic, of course, has also worsened the situation for the NGOs. It has become harder to work, particularly in the refugee policy field. in complex zones, NGOs are now very often left alone. There's less assistance on the part of the states. There's less funds, and there's also less attention towards the problem. So we see that NGOs are working in the past as they did, but we also see new kinds of initiatives. And one of the effects also of COVID-19 is that some policies measures have been left aside, right? So NGOs are suffering because they're already before the pandemic not very supported by the state. They have this double function of being both the watchdog and also proactive actors, and that's not always welcomed by states. Interestingly enough, is that what we see now is that although COVID-19 has worsened the conditions, there's less funds, there's less coordination, there's more diversion of attention. At the same time, we can say that these civil society or NGOs have increased their legitimacy because they are taking on more roles. They are both the traditional roles and more innovative roles. And they have diverted their funds towards the needs that are now in place, because NGOs and civil society is much more flexible than the state. So they can actually move around and they can shift their attention and shift their work and focus in a much quicker way. So what we see now, and I think this is something that we will explore more later on, and we will understand more of as it unfolds, is that it has taken both the traditional and a more innovative role in dealing with this pandemic and the situation.
Thank you, Sunava. And I see that now we are soon wrapping it up. So maybe it's time to open up for the audience if there is any question from you. Otherwise, you still have 8 minutes if anyone wants to ask questions, also for the Zoom audience. Or otherwise, I thought that on the 23rd of September, the European Commission came up with a new migration pact that is proposing to propose single cohesive migration policy for the European Union. It still has to go through the Council and the Parliament, but Loreen, I'm very interested to hear your opinion on the pact. And also at the same time, if you can reflect on what has been happened in Greece regarding the government, because it seems like they are trying to now unify the camps, close down the camps, and create maybe one camp. And I also heard about some other tendencies. So if maybe we can have that as the last question. It would be really great to hear your comments on those 2 points.
Yeah, so first on the changes in the Greek government, I mentioned before about this move towards detention centers, which has really been government policy even before they were elected into the government. It was part of their platform they were elected on. Now we've seen detention centers being built in the different islands. There was an announcement in Lesvos to turn Moria into a detention center. There was pushes by the government to build new detention centers. Now we've seen they built a new center, which is not clear yet if it will be a closed center or not, but it's looking like it very will be, and it's even now has restricted access. Only a certain number of people are allowed to leave every day during certain hours. So it's already becoming more and more like a closed detention center. But in addition to the move for more detention centers, the asylum law was also amended in the beginning of this year and again in June, which at every step of the way was kind of streamlining the asylum process with a clear intent to be able to enforce returns to Turkey more quickly. So it was there were these 2 series of amendments to the asylum law, which take a lot of procedural rights away, place obstacles for people to be able to appeal negative decisions, implement an accelerated procedure, which there's basically no procedural guarantees and very unlikely that people will be able to access legal aid. So these are kind of the legal changes that have happened since January of this year. And I mentioned this before as well, but the European Migration Pact has basically endorsed all of these policies which the Greek government is already implementing. and suggests implementing them at a Europe-wide scale. So Lesvos, we've always talked about Lesvos kind of being a pilot project for bad migration policy, and now we've seen this is exactly what they're doing with the European Migration Pact. I wanted to also comment about some things that have been happening on the island lately, because you mentioned just before about the targeting of solidarity work, the criminalization of solidarity work. This is something that we are facing here in Lesvos and in Greece in general. In an administrative way, there's been a lot of administrative burdens that have been placed on NGOs that are working specifically with asylum seekers, which, especially for small organizations, are making it almost impossible for us to continue to exist because of the burdens placed in terms of accounting obligations, in terms of certifications that are required to continue working. So this is one thing, that through these increased requirements, they're placing burdens in a discriminatory way only on NGOs that are working with asylum seekers. And then we see also the criminalization of groups in different ways. So for example, there was an announcement in Greece that 4 different organizations are now being investigated for smuggling, for human trafficking, for creation of a criminal and participation in a criminal organization. Very serious accusations. These are all organizations that have been monitoring pushbacks. So this, to us, we haven't seen the case file. We don't know what's in the case file. No one has actually been arrested at this point, but there's been announcements in the press that the police has initiated this investigation. It's clearly targeting groups who are trying to monitor the crimes of the Greek state, and has a clear chilling effect on this work. Many of these organizations or members of these organizations have now left Greece. And I think this was the clear intention of the Greek state. At the same time, you have moves by the government since they came into power to evict squats, places where migrants were living in more dignified shelters. Then there's been a move away from hosting migrants in shelters and moving everyone to these closed detention centers. In Lesvos, we're seeing that there's been an announcement by the ministry that Pikva camp will be evicted by tomorrow. We still don't know if this is actually going to happen. There's been no kind of published order about the basis of the eviction. But this is, I mean, these are the kind of practices that we're seeing, and we are kind of on the front line of all of these practices here in Lesbos.
Thank you, Lauren. Since we have a few minutes left, so as it stands with the European Migration Pact now, it endorses a system that basically already exists. So if we want to move forward, how should we move forward, and why is it important that we really get a new perspective?
Well, indeed, as you say, a lot of the researchers that I've been reading the last days, that the question is this really a new comprehensive approach to policy? And it is, indeed, it's a mix of new and existing policy tools that they have introduced. It's really based on 3 pillars. The first one is externalization, which we have had to know. So agreements with sending countries, the collaboration with third countries. The second one is borders, reinforce or re-strengthening the border control. And the third pillar, you could say, is this intra-European solidarity. And they call it compulsory solidarity, which is a very funny concept. Like, how can a solidarity be compulsory? Whatever does that mean? And what we see really is that, and as Lorraine also talked about, we see what looks to be a continued detention, a Moria camp, hotspot approach. It doesn't look to be very much difference. The challenge is, of course, that the European Union have to find a way of dealing with very contesting preferences internally. That's one of the problems. And they're trying to find ways of how this solidarity relationship can move. They introduced this return sponsorship scheme where if you do not want to welcome asylum seekers, you can actually instead It's mine. Maybe I should take it off and then we continue. So.
No, it's nothing yet, but
Yeah, sorry, it's my laptop. So what should we do? What should be done? I think one of the things that needs to be done is really to rethink migration. We have to, European Union have to stop thinking about migration as a risk. It has to think about migration as opportunity, because one of the things which is behind the externalization is that they are saying migration is a risk to Europe. Keep them there, and they providing all kinds of treatments, treaties and economic incentives, so that third countries, so that's countries outside the European Union, will try to prevent migrants from continuing. By doing so, they are saying migrants is a risk and you have to control them. Instead of doing that, they have to rethink how we think about migration. It's not a risk, can be an opportunity. There should be different ways of labor migration, for example. And then finally, another thing I want to add is that we really have to make sure that the that the conventions are being upheld, that there's not only a quicker assessment of asylum application, that it's also fair, because a fair assessment. So now they're going into this idea that if we just do it quick enough, the problem will be solved. But will a quick evaluation of asylum ensure a fair evaluation of asylum applications?
You lost the guarantees as well.
Because
you lost the guarantees and the safeguards in the meantime.
Yeah.
But yes, we are over our time. Thank you everyone for joining us here physically, and also everyone on Zoom. Yeah, thank you for